Hector Calloway drove 3 iron fence posts into the sun-baked Texas earth the morning his wife was buried, and from that day forward, he swore on her still warm memory that no son of his would ever suffer what he had just suffered. The year was 1873, and the Calloway Ranch spread across 460 acres of rolling grassland south of Abilene, Kansas, where the cattle trails ran thick with dust and commerce, and the kind of hard living that left calluses on a man's soul before it put them on his hands. Hector had built every fence post, every stall board, every beam of the main house with his own 2 hands, and he had done it for Alina, who had come to him from Virginia with soft hands and bright eyes, and a laugh that sounded like water running over smooth river stones. Alina had died giving birth to their 3rd son, and Hector had held the boy red-faced and screaming and furiously alive, while the woman he loved went quiet in the late afternoon light. He named the baby Thomas because Alina had always liked the name. Then he went outside and drove those 3 iron posts into the ground, one for each son, and he made himself the promise. He kept it, too. For 11 years, Hector Calloway raised his boys on the ranch without a woman's hand in the house, without softness of any kind, and he repeated the warning every Sunday morning the way other fathers quoted scripture. The boys sat at the long pine table with their bowls of salted oatmeal, and their father stood at the head of it and said his piece. "A man who ties himself to a woman ties himself to grief," Hector would say. "You watch her every day, you love her every day, and then one day the ground opens up and swallows her, and there is nothing left but the work. So do the work. Do not love anything you cannot put a fence around." The 3 boys listened with varying degrees of patience. Caleb was the oldest at 24, broad-shouldered and quiet in the way of men who have long since decided that listening is more useful than talking. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes, and he ran the cattle operation with a steadiness that made the older ranch hands trust him instinctively. Eli was 22 and could not sit still for longer than it took to eat a meal. He was the one who broke horses, who raced across the open flats on Saturday afternoons, who grinned at everything as though life was a wonderful joke he had not yet heard the end of. He had his father's red-brown hair and his mother's easy warmth, and he spent it on everyone equally, which drove Hector half-mad because he said it was wasteful. Thomas was 18 in the spring of 1884, the youngest, the one whose birth had cost Alina her life, and he carried that knowledge the way a stone carries a scratch. It was always there. You just had to catch it in the right light to see it. He was quieter than Eli and less settled than Caleb, and he spent more time than either of his brothers reading, which Hector tolerated only because a man who could read a land contract was a man who would not be cheated. The Sunday morning that changed everything was in April of 1884, when the Kansas sky was the particular shade of pale blue that only appears for 3 weeks in spring before the summer heat burns it out of existence. Hector said his piece about grief and fences, and Caleb nodded, and Thomas stared into his oatmeal, and Eli laughed. "Papa," Eli said, "you have been saying that for 11 years, and it has not made you one bit happier." Hector looked at his middle son for a long moment. "It has kept me one bit smarter," he said, and that was the end of the conversation. But Eli was right, and somewhere in the private country of Hector Calloway's chest, he knew it. The Calloway Ranch employed 6 full-time hands and brought on a dozen more during roundup season. And it was through that seasonal work that the Caldwell family arrived. If you could call it arriving when the way they came was in a wagon with one broken wheel, a mule that was more opinion than animal, and a trunk full of what appeared to be everything they owned in the world. Hector saw the wagon from the ridge above the south pasture and rode down to see what the trouble was. He found a man named George Caldwell, who was somewhere between 50 and death, sitting on the side of the road with his hat in his hands and a look of complete defeat on his weathered face. Beside him stood a young woman who was clearly his daughter, holding the mule's bridle with one hand and shading her eyes with the other to look at Hector as he rode up. "Morning," Hector said. "It is not much of one," George Caldwell said. The young woman said nothing, but she looked at Hector with the direct, unblinking assessment of someone who has learned to read a situation fast. Her name, he would learn shortly, was June Caldwell. She was 20 years old, with sun-brown hair pulled back under a flat-brimmed hat, and eyes the color of sage after rain, and she was holding that mule's bridle with a grip that said she had been holding things together for a long time. Hector helped them fix the wheel. It was not a complicated repair. The spoke had shattered and the rim had come loose, and he had the tools in his saddlebag and the experience in his hands, and within an hour it was done. During that hour, he learned that George Caldwell had been a cattle drover who had damaged his leg in a stampede the previous autumn and could no longer ride, that June had been running the family's small operation on her own since then, and that they were heading for Abilene to see about finding work. "Could use a man who knows cattle," Hector said, looking at George. "Even a man who cannot ride can count heads and keep books and tell the difference between a healthy animal and a sick one." George Caldwell straightened slightly. "Can do all of that," he said, "and more." "The girl," Hector said. June Caldwell looked at him directly. "The girl can cook, mend fence, treat a horse for thrush, and read a contract," she said. "And the girl has a name." Hector almost smiled. "Miss Caldwell," he said, "can you cook for a household of 5 men?" "I have been cooking for 2 with half the supplies," she said. 5 sounds manageable." That was how the Caldwells came to the Callaway Ranch, and that was how everything changed. The first week passed quietly. George Caldwell settled into the small foreman's cabin on the eastern edge of the property, which had been empty since the previous foreman had moved on to California the previous year. June cooked and kept the house, and she did it with a practical efficiency that Hector had to grudgingly respect, and the 3 Callaway sons moved around her the way water moves around a stone, carefully, with awareness of her presence but without touching it directly. Caleb, being who he was, simply said good morning and thank you and went about his work. Illy, being who he was, talked to her constantly, bringing her wildflowers from the south pasture as a joke that was not entirely a joke, making her laugh with stories about the horses he had half broken, and the cattle who had opinions about being moved. Thomas read in the evenings on the porch, and sometimes June sat on the steps after dinner with a cup of coffee, and they did not talk much. But the silence between them was the comfortable kind that 2 people have to earn. Hector watched all of this with the vigilance of a man who has built something and intends to keep it. He was not a cruel man. He was clear about that in his own mind. He was a man who had learned what loss could do to a person, and he was trying to spare his sons that education. He watched June Caldwell move through his house, and he saw nothing but the ghost of a problem waiting to become real. He said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say. But he watched. It was Illy who cracked first, though not in the way anyone expected. It happened 3 weeks after the Caldwells' arrival, on a warm Saturday in early May when the cattle needed moving from the north pasture to the summer grazing ground 2 miles east. Illy was working the flank with a new horse, a gray gelding with a sideways temperament that he had been working on for 2 months, and the horse chose that particular morning to decide it was finished with the whole arrangement. The gray went sideways, then vertical, then sideways again, and Illy, who could ride anything, stayed on through the first 2 maneuvers and came off on the 3rd, landing hard in the dry grass 30 yards from where June was watching the whole thing from the fence rail with the expression of someone who is trying very hard not to laugh. Illy stood up, checked himself for damage, found none, and looked at the gelding, which was now standing 20 feet away looking profoundly self-satisfied. "Go ahead," June said. "Go ahead what?" "Laugh," she said. "I have been holding it in for 10 seconds and I cannot guarantee anything after 15. Illy looked at her. Then he looked at the horse. Then he started laughing and June started laughing, and the sound of the two of them went out across the morning pasture like something warm and clean. He was not in love with her then, but something tilted, like a scale when you put the first weight on it. He went home that evening and sat at the supper table and looked at June when she set down the bread and thought about the sound of her laughing and the way she had waited a careful 10 seconds before she let herself. The next morning he brought her wildflowers again, but this time there was no pretense of a joke. "These are for you," he said simply, and put them on the kitchen windowsill. June looked at them for a moment. "They are going to die," she said. "Everything does," he said, and then looked startled at himself, as though he had not meant to say something quite so honest. June put them in a tin cup with water, and they lasted 4 days, and he watched them each morning the way a man watches something he is not sure he is allowed to want. It was Thomas who noticed first, because Thomas was always watching things that other people thought no one was watching. He said nothing to Caleb, but he turned the information over in his mind the way he turned the pages of his books carefully, with attention to what each word actually meant. The thing was, Thomas understood his father's warning better than his brothers did, because he was the one who had been given the most specific reason to believe it. His mother had died for him. That was not something he had invented, it was the plain fact of the situation, and Hector had never said it unkindly. But Thomas had always known it the way you know the direction of the wind, without having to think about it consciously. He also knew, having spent 11 years watching his father, that the warning had not protected Hector Calloway from anything. It had only made him quieter about what he felt. The evening of the wildflowers, Thomas sat on the porch steps with his book, and June sat beside him with her coffee, and he said, without looking up from the page, "He has been bringing you flowers for 3 weeks as a joke. Today he was not joking." June was quiet for a moment. "I noticed," she said. "What are you going to do about it?" Another pause. "What would you suggest?" Thomas considered this. "I would suggest being honest," he said, "which is the advice I would never take myself and therefore feel perfectly qualified to give to someone else." June looked at him with something in her face that was almost like tenderness. "You are 18 years old," she said. "I know," he said. "It does not make me wrong." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "No, it does not." The thing was, June Caldwell was not certain how she felt about Ellie Calloway. She had not come to this ranch looking for anything except work and stability for her father, who tired more easily each week, and whose leg was healing slower than the doctor had hoped. She had not expected to find a household of complicated men, or a kitchen that needed someone to love it, or a middle son who laughed at himself falling off a horse and brought her wildflowers without a joke attached. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. Ellie was 22 and warm and funny and worked harder than anyone she had seen, and when he was near her the air had a different quality to it, the way it gets before a thunderstorm, charged and expectant. She was not certain if that was feeling or just the awareness of feeling, and she was practical enough to know the difference mattered. What she was certain of was that Hector Calloway would not be pleased. She had heard the Sunday morning speech twice by now. She had watched Hector's face during those speeches, the jaw set, the eyes somewhere far away, the absolute conviction of a man who has decided that his pain was instructive. She respected it, in the way you respect a fence that someone has built very carefully to keep something out, even if you think the thing they are trying to keep out is not actually dangerous. She decided to be honest, not with Ellie, not yet, but with herself. She admitted, in the privacy of her own thoughts, that she liked him, that she liked the way he moved and talked and looked at her, and that when he laughed it made her want to laugh too, and that she had thought about him in the quiet of her small room off the kitchen more than was strictly sensible. Having admitted it, she felt better. She could work with knowing what was true. The spring wore on, and the Calloway Ranch moved through its rhythms. Caleb managed the cattle with his usual quiet competence. Thomas read and worked and kept his own counsel. Illy worked the horses and talked to June whenever he could find a reasonable excuse, which turned out to be often, because a working ranch provides a remarkable number of reasonable excuses. He found her mending tack in the barn one afternoon and sat down across from her with a piece of harness that needed attention and worked beside her in silence for 20 minutes before either of them said anything. "Can I ask you something?" Ellie said. "You have not needed permission before," June said without looking up. "This is different." She looked up then. His face was serious in a way she had not often seen it, and it made him look older, or maybe just more like who he actually was underneath the grinning. "When you look at this ranch," he said slowly, "when you look at what my father built, do you see something worth building? Or do you see something worth leaving?" June put down the piece of harness she was working on and thought about the question carefully, because it deserved careful thought. "Both," she said finally. "You can build something worth leaving and something worth staying at the same time. The question is which one weighs more. Which one does it weigh?" He asked, and she understood that he was not asking about the ranch anymore. The moment stretched out between them, warm and precarious, like a soap bubble that knows it is a soap bubble. "Ask me again in a month," June said. "When I know the answer better." Illy nodded slowly. He picked up his piece of harness and went back to work, and for the rest of that afternoon they sat in the pleasant quiet of the barn, and the light came through the gaps in the boards in long golden slats, and June thought, with a combination of surprise and absolute certainty, that she had already known the answer for a week. Hector discovered the situation on a Sunday in June, which was appropriate, since Sunday was when he said his piece. He had gone to the barn after breakfast to check on a heifer that had been acting strangely, and on his way back through the kitchen yard, he saw Ellie leaning against the fence post at the edge of the garden, talking to June, who was hanging the washing. They were not touching. They were not even standing particularly close. But there was something in the way Ellie was leaning, and the way June had turned from the washing to answer him, and the way they were both smiling at the same thing, some invisible something that existed between them and not outside them, and Hector stopped walking. He stood there for a moment. Then he turned around and went back to the barn and stood very still in the cool dark of it and pressed his hands flat against the stall door and breathed. He was not angry. He was afraid, which is a thing that often wears anger's clothes. That evening he called Ellie into the study, which was really just a corner of the main room with a desk and a lamp, and he sat down and Ellie stood, and Hector looked at his middle son for a long time. "No," he said. Ellie looked at him. "I have not said anything." "You did not have to," Hector said. "I know my own sons." "Then you know," Ellie said, and his voice was steady in a way that Hector had not expected, "that I am not a boy anymore." "I know what you think you feel," Hector said. "Then tell me what I think I feel," Ellie said. "Explain it to me, since you know it better than I do." Hector's jaw tightened. "You feel the way every man feels when there is a young woman nearby who is kind to him, and he is young enough to think that feeling will last forever. It does not last. And when it goes, it takes something with it that you cannot get back." Ellie was quiet for a long moment. "Papa," he said, "I know what happened to Mama. I know what it cost you. I have known it my whole life, and I have watched what the not loving cost you too, and am telling you honestly that I would rather have the grief than the nothing." Hector looked at his son and felt, somewhere deep below the fear, a terrible pride. "Get out of my study," he said. Ellie got out. He went directly to the porch steps and sat down beside Thomas, who was there with his book as always, and said, "He said no. He said no to the general principle," Thomas said without looking up. "He does not actually have any authority over the specific situation. That is a fine distinction. It is the only kind worth making," Thomas said. Ellie looked out at the dark yard and the stars coming out over the Kansas flat, and he thought about June Caldwell and about grief and about fences and about what a person was willing to risk, and he came to a conclusion. The next morning he went to see June's father. George Caldwell was sitting in the chair outside the foreman's cabin with his legs stretched out and a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and the look of a man who is thinking about something far away. He looked up when Ellie came around the corner and said nothing, just waited with the patience of a man who has learned that waiting is cheaper than talking. "Mr. Caldwell," Ellie said, and then stopped. George looked at him. "Take your hat off when you are nervous," he said. "It is easier to think without it." Ellie took his hat off. "Now," George said, "say what you came to say." "I would like to court your daughter," Ellie said, "with your permission and with honest intention. Am 22 years old. Work this ranch and I will inherit a share of it. Cannot promise that my father will approve immediately, but I can promise that I mean what I say and I will prove it however you require." George Caldwell looked at him for a very long time. He had the kind of eyes that had been to difficult places and come back knowing the geography. "She is 20 years old," George said. "She has been running things since before I hurt my leg because I let her because she was better at it than me. She does not need my permission for anything, but she has always asked for it because she is kind and I appreciate that." He paused. "I would suggest you ask her." "I was planning to," Ellie said. "Good," George said. "Sit down, have some coffee. Tell me how that gray gelding is coming along." Ellie sat down and told him about the gray gelding, and by the end of the coffee both men were laughing, and something had been settled between them without needing to be named. Ellie found June in the afternoon. In the garden she had started at the side of the house where she had put in beans and squash, and a row of sunflowers that were only 6 inches tall but determined. She was on her knees in the dirt, and she looked up when she heard his boots on the dry ground. "I spoke to your father this morning," Ellie said. June sat back on her heels and brushed the dirt from her hands. "I know," she said. "He told me." "What did he tell you?" "That you took your hat off," she said, "and that the gray gelding is coming along." Ellie almost smiled. "I was wondering," he said, and stopped again, and she saw that the grinning was gone entirely and what was underneath it was something much more careful and real. "I was wondering if you would allow me to court you, properly, with the intention of—" He stopped. "With honest intention." June looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was falling across the garden and the young sunflowers and the man standing in front of her with his hat in his hands, and she thought about everything she had admitted to herself over the past month, and she said, "Yes." The single word fell between them like something clean. Ellie let out a breath slowly. "Your father also told me," he said, "that you do not need his permission for anything but that you always ask for it because you are kind." "He should not go around telling people things about me," June said, but she was smiling. "He is proud of it," Ellie said. She looked up at him in the afternoon light, and the moment was simple and uncomplicated, and felt like the beginning of something. Hector Calloway did not speak to Ellie about the matter for 2 weeks. He watched his son and George Caldwell's daughter with the careful, unhappy attention of a man who knows he is losing an argument and has not yet decided to stop making it. What he saw during those 2 weeks was not what he had expected to see. He had expected the dizzy foolishness of young feeling, the distraction, the carelessness. What he saw instead was Ellie working harder than ever, arriving at the barn before sunrise and staying until the light was gone, and he saw June taking on extra work in the kitchen garden without being asked, and he saw the two of them talking in the evenings on the porch steps about the ranch, about the cattle rotation, about the price of beef at the Abilene market, about the repair that the north fence needed before the summer. He did not know what to do with this information. It did not fit the story he had told himself. Caleb came to him on a Wednesday evening and sat in the chair across the desk and said, in the tone of a man reporting a weather system, "Ellie is happy." "I have eyes," Hector said. "He is also working better," Caleb said. "The gray gelding is ready for sale. He worked that horse in less time than any horse he has broken since he started. June told him she thought he could do it faster, and he did." Hector looked at his oldest son. That is not a reason to, Papa, Caleb said, quietly and without any heat. Am not arguing with you. Am just telling you what I see. Hector was quiet for a long moment. What else do you see? Caleb thought about this honestly. I see a woman who came here with nothing and has made everything she has touched better. See my brother, who was always good, becoming someone I respect even more. And I see you, he said carefully, holding a fence around a field that has already grown past it. Hector looked at his oldest son and felt that particular exhaustion that comes when someone says the true thing. Your mother would have liked her, Hector said. He had not intended to say it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said, she would have. Nothing was resolved that evening, but something shifted, the way the earth shifts in spring, not dramatically, but in a way that changes which direction the water runs. The summer came in with its full weight of heat and work, and the Callaway Ranch moved through roundup season with the organized chaos that Caleb managed with his quiet authority. And Ellie drove with his energy, and Thomas documented with a ledger book that he kept in a precise, even hand. June fed the extra seasonal hands and managed the kitchen, and rode out twice with the cattle when they were short a rider, which she did without drama and with considerable skill, and which raised Hector's estimation of her in a way he did not admit to but could not entirely hide. Ellie rode beside her on the second of those cattle days, and they worked the north flank together through the long afternoon, and when the herd was settled and the light was going golden, they pulled up on the ridge and looked out at the 460 acres of Callaway land and the cattle moving slow and dark across it and the sky above it all turning colors that had no names. This is what you would be choosing, Ellie said, if you were choosing. I know what it would be choosing, June said. He looked at her. This is a hard life. I know that too, she said. I have been living a hard life my whole life. The question is not whether it is hard. The question is whether it is mine. He thought about that. Is it? She looked at the land and the sky and the cattle and then at him, directly and without any pretense. It could be, she said. If you are asking. The moment held them both, and the evening light was extraordinary, and Ellie Callaway looked at June Caldwell on that ridge in the summer of 1884 and knew, with the absolute clarity that comes once in a life if you are lucky, that he was going to marry this woman or die trying. He was, as it turned out, going to have to do something approximately like the latter before the former became possible. It was Hector who forced the conversation, which surprised everyone including Hector. He came to the supper table on a Sunday in late July and sat down and looked at his oatmeal, which had been replaced by June with a proper breakfast of eggs and biscuits and salt pork, and he said, without preamble, Illy, when are you planning to ask her? The table went very quiet. Illy looked at his father. I was waiting, he said carefully, for your blessing. Hector was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, which were the hands of a man who had built 460 acres of life, and then tried to protect it so hard he had nearly kept all the good things out. Your mother, Hector said, and stopped. He tried again. Your mother used to say that the only thing worse than losing something you loved was never having it to lose. He paused. I disagreed with her at the time. And now, Illy said. Now, Hector said slowly, think she was smarter than me, which was also, for the record, something she used to say. Caleb made a small sound that might have been a laugh. Hector looked at Illy. She is a good woman, he said. She is capable and honest, and she works without complaint, and she makes this house feel the way it felt when he stopped. Ask her, he said. You have my blessing. Do not make me say it twice. Illy stood up from the table so fast his chair scraped back, and then he caught himself and looked at his father and said, Thank you, Papa, with a directness and sincerity that made Hector have to look at his coffee. Thomas, who had been eating his eggs with the peaceful expression of a man watching something he has known was coming, said, He practiced the proposal in the barn. Heard him. Thomas, Illy said. 3 different versions, Thomas said. The second one made the horses nervous. Thomas. The third one was quite good, Thomas said. I recommend the third one. June, who had come in from the kitchen to refill the coffee and had therefore heard all of this, set the pot down on the table with careful precision and looked at Illy with an expression that was somewhere between laughing and something softer. The second one made the horses nervous. She said, "It was a dramatic choice," Illy admitted. "Use the third one," June said, and went back to the kitchen. And Illy looked after her, and Hector looked at his coffee, and Caleb smiled at the table, and Thomas went back to his eggs with great satisfaction. Illy asked her that evening, on the porch, in the blue hour between sunset and dark. And he used the third version, which was not particularly eloquent but was absolutely honest. And June said yes the way she had said yes to courting, simply and with complete certainty, like someone answering a question they have known the answer to for a long time. He put a ring on her finger that had been his mother's, which Hector had given him that afternoon in the study, handing it over without a word, but with a look on his face that June later said she would remember always. The wedding was in September, small and proper, in the yard of the Calloway Ranch, with the minister from Abilene and George Caldwell standing straight with his hat in his hands and his eyes bright, and Caleb and Thomas standing beside Illy, and June in a dress that had been her mother's, let out at the hem and taken in at the waist, and the whole thing done in the warm September light with the smell of the prairie on the wind. Hector watched his son marry, and he did not cry, because he was Hector Calloway and crying was not something he did. But he stood very still through the whole ceremony with his hands clasped in front of him and his jaw set, and afterward, when it was done, he walked to June and took her hand in both of his and said, "Welcome to the Calloway Ranch, Mrs. Calloway." And the way he said it made it mean much more than the words. June kissed his cheek. He allowed it. What followed was a quiet revolution in the life of the Calloway Ranch. June brought her practicality and her warmth and her complete refusal to accept unnecessary suffering, and she went about improving things the way water improves things, not by force, but by finding every low place and filling it. She did not try to change Hector, but she cooked the food his wife used to make, because she had asked George if he remembered what Alina had made, and George had told her, and after the first time, she put Alina's apple preserve on the table. Hector sat very still for a long moment before he put it on his bread. He never mentioned it, but she made it every season. Illy was happy in the specific way of a man who has gotten the exact life he wanted and knows it. He worked with new purpose, taking on more responsibility at Caleb's encouragement, and he and June built their life in the room off the main house that Hector expanded for them the autumn after the wedding, adding 2 walls and a proper door without telling anyone he was doing it until it was done. "You did not have to do that," June said when she saw it. "It needed doing," Hector said and walked away. Caleb watched all of this. He watched Illy's happiness and June's competence, and the way the house had a different quality now, warmer, fuller, more like something. He watched his father's slow, grudging capitulation to joy, and he thought about what Thomas had said on the porch that spring evening about the only kind of distinction worth making. He was not in love. He did not have anyone to be in love with. But he felt the question forming in him the way a question does, slowly, like a crack in dry ground that you notice has been there for a while before you see how deep it goes. The question became specific in October, when the Caldwell situation changed. George Caldwell's leg had not healed correctly. The Abilene doctor said it plainly: the bone had knit wrong, and he would not ride again, and the work he could do was limited. George had accepted this with a dignity that impressed Hector, and he continued to keep the books and manage the supply records and do what sitting work the ranch required. But June worried about him in the quiet way of someone who carries worry carefully, so it does not spill, and one afternoon she mentioned to Caleb that her father had not been sleeping and she did not know what to do. "He needs something to be responsible for," Caleb said, thinking it through. "Something he can manage completely." June looked at him. "Yes," she said slowly, "that is exactly it." "The breeding records," Caleb said. We have been keeping them badly for 2 years. If your father took that over entirely, the bloodlines, the seasonal rotation, the documentation, it would take someone weeks of concentrated work to establish, and then regular attention. He could do it from the cabin or from the study. June looked at Caleb for a long moment with an expression of startled gratitude. That is exactly right," she said. "How did you see that so clearly?" Caleb shrugged. "I watch things," he said. June smiled. "So does Thomas. Must be a Calloway habit." "It is," Caleb agreed, and there was something easy between them in that moment, some comfortable frequency that Caleb noticed and filed away without quite knowing what to do with. The breeding records became George Caldwell's domain, and the effect was almost immediate. He sat at the desk in the study for 4 hours a day, sorting through years of incomplete records and bringing order to them with the methodical attention of a man who has found a purpose that fits his current capacity exactly. His color improved. He slept better. He talked to Hector about bloodlines, and Hector found himself actually interested in what the man had to say. "Your daughter fixed my father's loneliness," Caleb told June one afternoon, "and you fixed my ranch's records. You are both relentlessly useful." "I will take that as a compliment," June said. "It was one," Caleb said. They talked like that regularly now, easily, practically, about the ranch and its needs, and the upcoming winter, and the price of hay, and George's progress on the records, and Thomas's suggestion that they should look at diversifying slightly into horses, which Ellie strongly supported, and Hector had not yet weighed in on. June was the kind of person who made conversation feel productive without losing the pleasure of it, and Caleb, who had spent most of his life talking practically, found that the combination suited him. He was 31 now. 31 years old and bachelor in the specific way of men who have simply never made space in their lives for anything else. He had never been in love, had barely noticed the absence of it, had assumed that his father's warning and his own nature had combined to make him immune to the whole enterprise. He was finding, in the autumn of 1884, that he had simply been waiting for a frequency he could hear. There was, however, the matter of the woman who actually spoke that frequency. She arrived in November, which was later than anyone had expected and considerably more complicated than anyone had wanted. Her name was Clara Reeves, and she came because her father, who ran the only real mercantile in the nearby town of Harlan, had sent word to Hector that he needed someone to buy a winter supply of feed before the price went up, and the road to Harlan went through 12 miles of open country that had been having trouble with 2 men who were stealing freight. Hector sent Caleb because Caleb was the one you sent when you needed a thing done correctly. Caleb reached Harlan without incident, arranged the feed order at the mercantile, and was talking about transport with Edward Reeves when Edward's daughter came in from the back room with a ledger under her arm and said, "Father, the winter account figures are wrong, and if you review page 7, you will see where." Edward Reeves looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who is both irritated and aware that he is about to be corrected. "Clara," he said, "we have a customer." "I know," Clara said, and looked at Caleb directly. She was 26, brown-haired and precise in the way of someone who has been managing numbers for a long time and has the directness that comes with always being right about them. Her eyes were the particular dark brown that looks black in low light, and she had a way of looking at a situation that reminded Caleb of himself. "Mr. Calloway, I believe." "From the Calloway Ranch south of Abilene." "Yes," Caleb said. "The winter hay order," Clara said, opening the ledger to the correct page without looking. 400 bales of winter grass, 40 sacks of feed grain, 2 barrels of mineral salt. Is that correct?" "That is correct," Caleb said. "I will add 10% to the grain," she said. "The winter is running colder than usual, and your cattle will want more. Your father can return the surplus in spring if I'm wrong, but would rather be safe." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "That is," he said, "exactly the right call." Clara looked at him again with that direct, assessing look, and something passed between them that was not yet feeling, but was the geography of feeling, the topography that you recognize as the place where feeling lives. "Will you be transporting yourself or arranging delivery?" she said. "Delivery," Caleb said. "Can send 2 men and a wagon next week." "I will have it ready Thursday," she said, and went back to the ledger. Caleb conducted the rest of his business with Edward Reeves and rode home in the cold November afternoon, and that evening at supper said nothing except that the feed was arranged. But Thomas, who had the irritating habit of accuracy, looked at his brother across the table and said, "How is Harlan?" "Cold," Caleb said. "And the mercantile?" "Well stocked." "And the merchant's daughter?" Thomas said in a tone of complete innocence. The table went quiet. Ellie looked at Caleb with interest. Hector looked at his bread. "Competent," Caleb said, after a pause that was 1 second too long. Thomas said, and applied himself to his supper with perfect contentment. Ellie kicked him under the table. Thomas absorbed it philosophically. The feed delivery went to Harlan on Thursday, and Caleb went with it, which was not strictly necessary, and which he told himself was because he wanted to check the quality of the grain in person, which was also true and also not the main reason. Clara Reeves had everything organized in the mercantile yard with the precision of someone who does not like wasting anyone's time, including her own. The bales were counted and stacked, and the sacks were weighed, and the salt barrels were rolled out, and she stood in the cold morning air with her ledger, and ticked off each item with a focused, economical attention. When it was done, she looked at the figures and said, "That is correct. If you will sign here." Caleb signed. He handed back the ledger. Their fingers did not touch because neither of them was the kind of person who manufactures contact, but the exchange was very deliberate and very aware. "You added 10% to the grain," he said. "I did," she said. "What if the winter is mild?" "Then you return the surplus and I credit your account," she said. "Told you this on Monday." "I remember," he said. "I was making conversation." Clara looked at him with slight surprise. "Were you?" "I was trying to," he said, which was more honest than he had intended. Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but the preparation for one. "The winter will not be mild," she said. "The river was running lower than usual through October." "It always means a harder cold." "I did not know that," Caleb said. "Most people do not," she said. "My father taught me. He is better at reading the land than the books, which is why I handle the books." "And who handles the land reading?" "I do both," she said, which made him look at her with an attention that was not about business at all. He rode home in the cold afternoon and went directly to the barn, and stood with his hand on the gray gelding's neck. Ellie had not sold the horse after all, had kept him because he ran well and thought about Clara Reeves and her ledger and her direct eyes, and the way she said, "Do both." He went inside and found Thomas in the kitchen with June, who was teaching him to make biscuits, which he was doing with the serious application of a man who has decided that every skill is worth having. "Thomas," Caleb said. "Yes," Thomas said, not looking up from the dough. "When you told me I was holding a fence around a field that had already grown past it," Caleb said. "Were you talking about yourself too?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. He pressed the dough carefully. "I did not think so at the time," he said. "And now," Thomas looked at his brother. He was 18 and had read more books than anyone else in the county, and had watched his father's grief and his brother's love and his own careful distance from all of it. And he said, slowly and honestly, "I think I was talking about all of us." June said nothing. She had learned when to be very still. Caleb nodded once. Then he went to the study and sat at the desk and wrote a letter to Edward Reeves at the Harlan Mercantile, asking whether Mr. Reeves would be willing to discuss a possible long-term supply arrangement, and whether he might suggest a time when Caleb could come to Harlan to review the terms in person. The reply came the following week. Edward Reeves suggested the following Friday. The letter was in a precise, even hand that Caleb recognized immediately as not Edward's. Clara had written the reply. He went to Harlan on Friday, and the discussion of the supply arrangement was real and useful, and lasted about 40 minutes. And after it was concluded, Edward Reeves suggested that Caleb stay for supper, which was a genuine frontier hospitality that Caleb accepted with genuine gratitude. The supper was in the rooms behind the mercantile, which were warm and cluttered with the pleasant clutter of a busy household, books and ledgers, and a cat, and the smell of something good on the stove. Clara sat across from him at the table, and they talked about the supply arrangement, and then about the cattle market, and then about Abilene and the changes the rail line had brought to it, and then about books, because the cat knocked a volume off the shelf and Caleb picked it up and said, "I have read this," and Clara said, "So have I, and I think the author is wrong about the third argument." And they were off on a conversation that lasted through supper and the cleaning up and a subsequent cup of coffee. And Edward Reeves went to bed at 9 o'clock saying he had an early morning, which was true and also a useful excuse. In the kitchen, with the lamp between them and the cold night pressing at the windows, Caleb said, "May I come back?" Clara looked at her coffee. "On what pretext?" she said, not unkindly. "No pretext," he said. "I would like to come back without one." She was quiet for a moment. "Am not an easy person to know," she said. "Am direct and I care about accuracy, and I have opinions that I state, and some people find that uncomfortable." "Find it remarkable," Caleb said simply. Clara looked at him. For a moment her face was completely open, the precision and the practicality gone, and underneath them someone quite different who had been waiting to be seen for a long time. "Then come back," she said. He came back the following Friday and the one after that, and by the third Friday Edward Reeves had stopped pretending to stay up past 9 o'clock. The supply arrangement was, in practice, simply an excuse that everyone had agreed not to examine too closely. Hector discovered this state of affairs at Christmas, when Caleb asked if he could invite the Reeves family to the Callaway Ranch for the Christmas meal. Hector looked at his oldest son. "Edward Reeves is a good man," Caleb said, meeting his father's eyes without flinching. "And his daughter," Hector said, "is a remarkable woman," Caleb said. "Am telling you honestly and without any drama. Intend to court her properly and with respect, and I would like your awareness of it, if not your blessing." Hector looked at his oldest son for a long time. He thought about Alina. He thought about the iron fence posts. He thought about Ellie and June in the September light, and about the breeding records that had given George Caldwell something to live for, and about the apple preserves he ate every season without mentioning them. "Invite them," Hector said. "I would like your blessing too," Caleb said. Another long pause. "You have it," Hector said. "Now let me have some peace." The Christmas meal was the fullest the Callaway table had been since Alina died, and it was also the most alive. George Caldwell came with his improved color and his breeding record notes that he wanted to discuss with Hector. Edward Reeves came with a bottle of good brandy and the easy sociability of a man who has spent his life in commerce and knows how to talk to anyone. Clara came in a blue dress that Caleb had never seen before and sat beside him at the long pine table, and they talked to everyone and also to each other. And across the table, Ellie watched his brother with quiet delight, and June watched Clara with the interested attention of someone who is already deciding they are going to be friends. Thomas watched everything with his usual composed attention, and then slipped outside after dessert to sit on the porch steps with a glass of the good brandy and the cold Christmas stars. He was 18 years old, and it was 1884, and he had spent his entire life being the most observant person in any room, and he had watched his oldest brother begin to fall the way a careful man falls slowly, with attention to where his feet were, and he had watched Ellie fall the way Ellie did everything, with his whole heart and no hesitation, and he had thought for a long time that he was simply a different kind of person, one who observed love rather than participating in it. He was beginning to suspect, sitting in the cold Christmas dark, that he had simply not yet met the person who made it make sense. He did not know yet that he would meet her in February. January passed in the frozen silence that Kansas winters impose on everything living. The ranch contracted into itself the way animals do in cold, conserving, waiting, minimal. The cattle needed extra feed, exactly as Clara had predicted, and the grain stores held, exactly as she had anticipated. Hector noted this in his private way by saying nothing except to Caleb, "The Reeves girl knows her business." "Yes," Caleb said, "she does." February brought the thaw, unsteady and cold in the mornings and muddy by afternoon, and with the thaw came the kind of trouble that frontier towns managed badly. A man from a neighboring ranch named Whitaker, who ran a smaller operation 8 miles to the west, came to the Calloway Ranch on a Tuesday morning and said there had been a fire. Not at his ranch. At the Parker homestead, 2 miles east of Whitaker's land, where a man named Samuel Parker had been trying to farm a quarter section with what he had, which was never enough. The fire had taken the Parker barn and one of the storage buildings, and Samuel Parker's wife had died the previous year, and he had 3 children and no ability to rebuild without help. Hector called his sons together. This was the frontier, and neighbors were neighbors, and the Calloway Ranch was, by the standards of the region, a substantial operation, and Hector had always believed that a man who had enough had an obligation to those who did not. "We will go Thursday," he said. "Bring lumber. Bring 2 extra men." It was on the Thursday rebuilding effort that Thomas met Rebecca Parker. She was not a Parker by birth. She was Samuel Parker's sister, who had come from Wichita when she heard about the fire to help with the children and the rebuilding, and she arrived the same morning as the Calloway crew, coming over the flat in a rented wagon with 2 trunks and an expression of absolute determination. She was 19 years old and small in the way that makes people underestimate the person inside. With red hair that came from nobody, anyone could currently identify, and eyes the pale gray-green of winter sky just before it clears. She jumped down from the wagon without waiting for assistance, and immediately assessed the state of the burned barn site with a quick, intelligent look. "The east wall is still standing," she said, to no one in particular. "If you work from that and build west, you save half the foundation work." Thomas, who was standing near the burned site with a measuring line in his hands and had been thinking exactly the same thing, looked at her. She looked back. "That is correct," he said. "I know," she said, without any vanity, just with the confident accuracy of someone stating a true thing. Thomas looked at her for another moment, and something in him, the part that had been watching and waiting for the person who made it make sense, said, very quietly, "Oh." He said nothing else immediately. He went about the rebuilding work with his usual thorough attention, and she went about organizing the Parker household with hers, and they were in the same 50 feet of space for 6 hours and spoke maybe 12 times, each exchange practical and precise, and underneath the practicality, aware of the other person in the specific way that cannot be faked. At the end of the day, when the east and west walls were up and the framework for the roof was begun and the Parker children had been fed and the Calloway crew was preparing to ride back, Thomas walked past the point where Rebecca was standing and said, without breaking stride, "East wall was the right call." "Obviously," she said. He stopped. He turned around. "Am Thomas Calloway," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "Illy Calloway's younger brother, the one who reads." "The one who reads," Thomas repeated. "Is that how people describe me?" "It is how your brothers described you when I asked," she said. He looked at her with complete attention. "You asked about me?" A pause. She looked at the east wall of the rebuilt barn. "I asked which Calloway brother that was," she said. "They told me." Thomas thought about this. "My name is Thomas," he said again, "in case you would prefer to use it." "Rebecca Parker," she said. "Though Parker is my brother's name. Mine is Ashford, Rebecca Ashford." "Miss Ashford," he said, "will you be in the area long?" She looked at him then directly with those pale gray-green eyes. "Long enough," she said, which was not quite an answer and not quite anything else, and Thomas Calloway, who had spent his life being precise about language, understood perfectly what it meant. He rode home in the cold February dusk and sat at the supper table and ate his meal and said nothing until Thomas said, in a voice of perfect calm, "I will be going back Thursday." Illy looked at him. "To help with the barn," Thomas said. "The barn will be done by Wednesday," Caleb said. "There is still fencing to replace," Thomas said. Illy was smiling. June was not smiling, but her eyes were. Hector was looking at his bread with great concentration. "Fencing," Caleb said. "A good fence properly built," Thomas said steadily, "takes considerably longer than a barn." Hector looked up from his bread. He looked at his youngest son, 18 years old and quiet and watchful, and the reason his mother was gone, and the person who had always carried that knowledge with more grace than anyone had a right to expect. He looked at Thomas for a long moment. "Go fix the fence," he said. Thomas went. He went Thursday and again the following Monday and the Monday after that, and each time he found Rebecca Ashford doing something useful and entirely willing to pause it when he appeared. They talked. They talked the way that two people talk when they have both been quiet for a long time and have suddenly found the right person to be unquiet with carefully at first, then with increasing frequency and depth, until the conversations were long and wandering, and full of the kind of honest disclosure that people do not make to strangers, but only to someone who has stopped being a stranger before you can precisely identify when it happened. She had come from Wichita, where she had been working in a milliner's shop, which she was good at and which she found insufficient. She had been managing her own money since she was 16, because her parents had died within a year of each other, and Samuel was the only family she had left, and necessity had made her independent with a completeness that she wore easily, without making a drama of it. She had opinions about a great many things and she stated them. She was funny in the dry, understated way that Thomas was funny, and when she made him laugh it was the full laugh, not the polite one, and she noticed the difference and seemed to find it satisfying. On the fourth visit, which was in early March and which was nominally about helping Samuel Parker source new seed for the spring planting, Thomas sat beside Rebecca on the porch steps of the Parker house in the cold afternoon sun and said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "Have spent my entire life," he said, "being the person who watches, who observes. I watched my father's grief and I watched my brother's and I watched everyone around me and I took careful notes and kept a careful distance and told myself that was simply who I was." He paused. "I do not think that anymore." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "What do you think now?" "I think," Thomas said slowly, "that I was waiting, without knowing I was waiting." The wind moved across the flat, carrying the smell of early spring and mud and something green. "Thomas," Rebecca said. "Yes. Have been here 5 weeks, and in another 3 weeks the barn and the fencing and the spring planting will all be finished, and there will be no more reason for me to stay," she said. His jaw tightened slightly. "Yes. So if you have something to say," she said, "you should probably say it." Thomas looked at her. "I would like to court you," he said, "with honest intention and with I do not have a great deal to offer yet. Am 18 and I work a share of the Calloway Ranch and I read books and am better at watching than at acting, which I'm working on." He paused. "But I'm working on it, if you would be willing to let me." Rebecca looked at him for a long moment with those pale gray-green eyes that saw things clearly. "Came to help my brother," she said quietly. "I did not come here to find anything else." "But I have found," she stopped. "I think I have found something anyway." Thomas let out a slow breath. "Is that a yes?" "That is a yes," she said. He nodded once. "Good," he said, and then, "I also want to tell you something else, and I want to say it before anything else is said." She waited. "Mother died when I was born," he said. "Have known that my entire life. It is the thing that most." He stopped. "It is the reason my father says what he says about marriage, and I want you to know it before anything else because I do not want to be someone who holds information back." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. "I know," she said gently. "Illy's wife June told me when asked about the family." Thomas looked at her. "You asked?" "I ask," she said simply. About things I want to know. Something shifted in Thomas's face, something careful and long-held, and he looked at this woman who asked about things she wanted to know, and who stated her opinions, and who had managed herself since 16, and who looked at the east wall of a burned barn, and immediately knew the right thing to do, and he felt something he had been watching for a long time from a careful distance finally resolve itself into a clear and present reality. "Thank you," he said. He did not specify for what. He did not need to. The spring of 1885 came to the Calloway Ranch in waves, each week warmer than the last, and the land opened up again the way it did every year, wild and generous and enormous, and the work started back in earnest. Clara Reeves came to the ranch the first weekend of April at Caleb's invitation, with her father and a buggy and the blue dress and also a practical riding outfit, because she had asked what she should bring and June had told her. She rode out with Caleb on the Saturday afternoon, and he showed her the 460 acres, and she asked intelligent questions about the cattle rotation and the water sources and the winter damage to the north fence, and he answered them all, and somewhere in the middle of the second hour of riding she said, "This is a very good piece of land." "My father built it," Caleb said. "You maintain it," she said. "Together," he said. She looked at him sideways with the preparation for a smile that he had come to know. "Yes," she said, "together seems right." They stopped on the ridge where Illy and June had stopped the previous summer, and the spring light was different from the summer light but equally remarkable, and Clara looked out at the land with the expression of someone doing a serious calculation. "Caleb," she said. "Yes, you are not very good at saying what you mean," she said. "You are excellent at showing it, but the saying of it requires more attention." He looked at her. "I'm aware of that. I'm telling you," she said, turning to look at him directly, "because if you are going to say something, this appears to be an appropriate setting, and I would rather you say it than let it continue being implied." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved her hair slightly. The cattle moved far below. The sky was enormous and perfectly blue. "I love you," he said. "Have never said that to anyone who was not family. I mean it without any qualification or reservation. Would like to marry you if you will have me." Clara looked at him with her dark eyes and her direct assessment and the something underneath the precision that he had seen in her kitchen in November. "Yes," she said, "I will have you." A pause. "I love you too, since we are being direct about it." He kissed her. It was the first time, and it was on the ridge above the Calloway land in the April light, and it was exactly right. He asked Edward Reeves that evening, with formality and sincerity, and Edward said yes with a speed that suggested the question was not surprising him. He told his father, who looked at his oldest son with the quiet pride of a man who has been fighting a battle and finally understands that he was on the wrong side of it. "You are all determined to prove me wrong," Hector said. "We are determined to prove Mama right," Caleb said. Hector was quiet for a very long moment. "Yes," he said, "I suppose that is more accurate." Rebecca Ashford came to the Calloway Ranch for the first time at Thomas's invitation, for Sunday dinner in April, which was the most crowded Sunday dinner the Long Pine table had seen in its existence. Hector sat at the head, and Illy and June sat across from Caleb, and Clara sat beside Caleb, and George Caldwell sat at the foot, and Thomas sat beside Rebecca, who looked at everything with her clear gray-green eyes and was entirely herself, which was the best thing she could have been. Hector looked at Rebecca during the dinner with the attention of a man who has done this twice before and knows that it is real each time. She met his eyes directly. She stated an opinion about the spring planting that was correct, and that Hector acknowledged was correct. She asked George Caldwell about the breeding records with genuine curiosity, and he talked for 20 minutes, and she followed every word. After dinner, when the women were in the kitchen and the men were on the porch, Hector sat in his chair and looked out at the April evening and said nothing for a while. Then he said, to no one in particular and to all of them at once, "Your mother would have liked all of them." It was the third time he had said some version of this, and it was the first time he said it about all three women at once, and it landed on the porch with the weight of something permanent. "Yes," Thomas said. She would have. Illy reached over and put his hand briefly on his father's shoulder, and Hector allowed it, and nobody said anything else for a while, and the evening light did its good work on the land. Thomas proposed to Rebecca in June, 4 months after they had met, on a Sunday afternoon when they were sitting beside the creek at the south edge of the Calloway property, where the cottonwood trees grew and the water was still cold from the mountains 200 miles west. He had a ring that he had bought in Abilene the previous week, a modest one with a small pale stone, and he had not practiced the proposal in the barn because he was not Illy, and he had not planned elaborate language because he was Thomas, and what he said was, "I want to build a life with you. I want it to be here, on this land, and I want you to be the person I talk to about everything important. I want you to ask about things and I will tell you, and I will ask about things and you will tell me, and I think that is the right foundation for everything else." He opened the ring box. "Will you marry me?" Rebecca looked at the ring and then at him. "Yes," she said, "on the same terms." "Complete honesty." "Complete honesty," he agreed. She let him put the ring on her finger. Then she said, "You are 18 years old." "Yes," he said. "That is very young to be this certain," she said. "I know," he said. "Am certain anyway." She looked at him with her clear eyes. "So am I," she said. He went to his father that evening and said he needed to speak with him, and they went to the study, and Thomas stood and Hector sat, and Thomas said, "I'm asking Rebecca Ashford to marry me and I want your blessing." Hector looked at his youngest son. He looked at the boy whose birth had cost Alina everything and who had grown into a man who was, in some ways, the truest image of what Alina would have wanted from a son: the reading, the watching, the careful honesty, the warmth behind the quiet. "She is a good woman," Hector said. "She is," Thomas said. "And I love her." Hector looked at the desk. He looked at his hands. He thought about iron fence posts driven into baked earth and the promise he had made and the 11 years of keeping it and what it had cost him and what it had not protected anyone from. "Your mother used to say," he said slowly, "that the bravest thing a person could do was love something completely, knowing that every good thing ends." Thomas waited. "I disagreed with her," Hector said. "For 31 years I disagreed with her." He looked up at Thomas. "You are all proving her right, one by one." "Yes," Thomas said. "You have my blessing," Hector said. "Sit down. Tell me about the girl's brother's place. How are they managing without her?" Thomas sat down and told him, and they talked for an hour about Samuel Parker's spring planting and the rebuilding effort and the state of the small homesteader operations in the county. And somewhere in that conversation, Hector said, quietly and without making a ceremony of it, "Your mother would have been proud of the man you are." And Thomas felt something he had carried since birth, the weight of the thing he had cost, shift and lighten, not disappear, but become something he could hold differently. The 3 Calloway weddings did not happen all at once, because the Calloway Ranch was a working operation and not a theater production, and logistics were managed by the people who managed logistics. Caleb and Clara married in May of 1885. In Harlan at Edward Reeves's church, because it was Clara's town and Clara's community, and Clara had decided without making it a discussion, and Caleb had agreed immediately, which pleased her. The Calloway Ranch sent 2 wagons to Harlan for the occasion, and the minister performed the ceremony in a church that smelled of pine sap and candle wax and the good effort of a frontier congregation. Clara wore her mother's veil and her own practical dress, and she said her vows in the direct, unambiguous way she said everything. And Caleb said his in a voice that was quiet and absolute. And Edward Reeves cried steadily through the whole thing, which he later attributed to the cold air, which no one believed. Clara moved to the Calloway Ranch, which required the addition of another room to the main house, which Hector and Caleb built together over the course of 3 weekends, working side by side in the comfortable silence of men who have been working together their whole lives. Clara came out on the second Saturday with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to each of them, and Hector took his without comment, and Clara went back inside, and after a moment Hector said to Caleb, "She is good." "I know," Caleb said. "You have chosen well," Hector said. Caleb looked at his father sideways. "Are you going to tell Illy and Thomas the same thing?" "Already told Illy," Hector said. "Thomas will have to wait his turn." The summer of 1885 on the Callaway Ranch was the most alive it had been in 12 years. There was a woman in the kitchen who was not June. Clara had taken over the accounts from George Caldwell, not because George's work had been poor, but because George's leg had worsened again in the spring, and the doctor in Abilene had said the sitting was doing him no favors either. And Clara had devised a system by which George supervised, and she executed, and both of them were satisfied. George spent more time outside in the summer warmth, and his color held, and Hector found himself talking to the older man in the evenings on the porch with the ease of people who have found an unexpected friendship. June had expanded the kitchen garden considerably, and started a small kitchen garden exchange with the Parker homestead, sending vegetables east and receiving eggs and early tomatoes in return, which was the kind of efficient frontier economy that worked beautifully when the people involved were sensible. Samuel Parker came to the Callaway Ranch occasionally for advice, and Thomas talked to him frankly about land management and spring planting, and the relationship between the two properties grew into something resembling a small community. Rebecca came to the Callaway Ranch most Sundays and some Saturdays, riding the 12 miles herself on a horse that Samuel Parker had given her, because she had saved the household from what might have been a very bad spring. She and Thomas talked endlessly about the books he lent her, and the things she had seen in Wichita, and the question of whether they should build their own house on the south edge of the Callaway property or add to the main house, and about the future in general with the specific, practical enthusiasm of two people who have figured out they are building the same thing. They married in September, the same month Illy and June had, which felt right to Thomas because September was when things settled into what they were going to be for the long term. The ceremony was at the Callaway Ranch, in the same yard where Illy and June had married, and Rebecca wore a dress that June and Clara had helped her make over the course of 3 summer weekends with cloth from Clara's father's mercantile, and a pattern that Clara had from an Abilene dressmaker. It was simple and well made, and Rebecca looked exactly like herself in it, which was the best possible outcome. Hector stood in the September light and watched his youngest son marry this woman with the red hair and the clear eyes and the opinions she stated directly. And he thought about Alina standing in a Virginia yard in 1858 with soft hands and bright eyes and a laugh like water. And he felt the grief and the gratitude both, simultaneous and inseparable, the way they always were, when he let himself feel them at all. After the ceremony, when the dinner was done and the guests were settled, and the September evening was coming in cool and sweet, Hector Callaway walked out to the south pasture alone and stood in the grass and looked at the sky going dark above the Kansas flat. He thought about the 3 iron fence posts he had driven into the ground 12 years ago. He thought about the promise he had made. He thought about how he had believed, truly believed, that he was protecting something. He thought about 11 years of Sunday morning speeches over salted oatmeal and what they had and had not accomplished. He thought about Illy on the ridge in the summer light, and Caleb in the church in Harlan, and Thomas in the September yard, and all 3 of them saying their vows with the same absolute quiet certainty. And he thought about Alina saying the bravest thing a person could do was love something completely knowing that every good thing ends. She had said it to him specifically because she had known even then, even in the first years, that he was the kind of man who held things too tight, who confused protection with prevention. She had said it gently, the way she said hard things, and he had dismissed it gently, the way he dismissed things he was not ready to hear. He heard it now, standing in the south pasture with the stars coming out and his 3 sons inside with their wives, and the house full of light and life, and the particular warmth of a place that has been claimed by people who intend to stay. He heard it with everything. He stayed out there a while. Then he turned around and walked back to the house where the light was on. The years that followed were the good years, the ones that make the earlier hardness make sense in retrospect. Clara and Caleb's first child came in the spring of 1886, a boy they named William Edward, for Caleb's father and Clara's, because they were practical about these things. He was a loud, red-faced, furiously alive baby who looked at the world from the beginning with his mother's dark eyes and his father's calm attention, and who from his very first weeks showed every sign of becoming a person who was good at everything and quiet about it. Hector held the baby on the second day and sat in the chair by the window with him for a long time without speaking, and Clara watched from the bed and saw something on her father-in-law's face that she had not seen before, something open, something undefended, something that had stopped fighting. "He looks like his grandmother," Hector said finally. It was not a question. "Does he?" Clara said softly. "Her eyes," Hector said. "Eleanor had those eyes." He said nothing else, but he held William Edward for another hour. Ellie and June's first child came in the summer of 1886, 3 months after William Edward, a boy they named James George for June's father. James was everything his father had been as a baby, according to Hector, who said it without any softness but with a private satisfaction. He was loud and energetic and smiled constantly. And George Caldwell, who held him in the foreman's cabin and looked at his grandson with the eyes of a man who has been given a gift he did not expect to live to receive, was the happiest that June had seen him in years. The children changed the ranch in the same way the wives had changed it, not dramatically, but fundamentally. The yard that had been quiet and purposeful became a place where small people played, and the pine table got longer, and the Sunday mornings changed their character from Hector's warning speeches to something considerably noisier and more joyful. Hector stopped giving the speeches. He simply stopped, one Sunday in the autumn of 1886, and never started again. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody needed to. Thomas and Rebecca's first child came in the winter of 1887, a boy they named Henry for no one in particular, just because they both liked it. Henry arrived in January with a full head of dark hair and the quiet, attentive expression of a baby who is already taking careful notes. Thomas sat beside Rebecca's bed all night and held her hand, and afterward sat in the chair by the fire with his son, and looked at him with an expression of such complete wonder that Rebecca watched him from the bed and felt, with absolute certainty, that this was the life she was supposed to have, here in this room on this ranch with this particular quiet man. George Caldwell died peacefully in the spring of 1887, in the foreman's cabin with the breeding records completed and in order on the desk, and with June sitting beside him holding his hand. He had said the previous week that he was satisfied, and he had meant it completely, and June, who grieved with the full depth of a woman who has loved her father honestly, was also able to hold the satisfaction alongside the grief, because it was true. Hector drove a fence post into the ground in the east pasture after the burial, as he always did for the people he had lost, and June watched him do it and understood without being told and put her hand briefly on his arm afterward, and he nodded once and they went inside. The Callaway Ranch expanded in the years that followed, a fourth room added to the main house, a new barn built with Ellie's supervision and Thomas's design, a second foreman's cabin for the head hand they hired to manage the growing operation. Caleb and Clara took on the eastern edge of the property and built a small separate house there, close enough to come for Sunday dinner and far enough to have their own life, which suited both of them. Thomas and Rebecca did the same on the south edge, with the house they had planned over 2 years of Sunday conversations finally built in the spring of 1888. The three houses, the main one, and the eastern, and the southern and the foreman's cabin were, by 1888, the visible evidence of something that Hector Calloway had feared and tried to prevent, and finally, at considerable cost to his own stubbornness, learned to see as what it actually was. A family built the way good things are built, not by protecting against loss but by risking it deliberately, over and over, with the specific courage that a leaner had always said was the bravest kind. In the spring of 1889, Clara had her second child, a girl they named Leaner, which nobody had asked Hector about beforehand. Caleb simply told him the name the morning after she was born, and Hector looked at his son for a long moment and then went to see his granddaughter and held her in the chair by the window, the same chair he had held William Edward in, and nobody saw his face for the long time he sat there. But when he came out his eyes were red and he said only, "Good name," and went to do the morning work. June had her second child that same year, a girl named Helen, who came into the world with her father's energy and her mother's precision, and immediately seemed to be planning a great many things. Ellie was besotted from the first minute and said so frequently, and June told him he was going to spoil her, and Ellie said that was entirely his intention, and June said she supposed she would have to be the sensible one, and Ellie said that was why he had married her, and they grinned at each other across their daughter like the people they were, warm and absolute and lucky. Rebecca had a second son in 1889, a boy named Illy, after Thomas's brother, which made Illy Calloway emotional in the particular way that strong men get emotional when something hits the exact right spot. "You did not have to do that," Illy told Thomas. "She suggested it," Thomas said. "She asked me who I admired most, and I told her." Illy looked at his younger brother. They were sitting on the porch of the main house in the early autumn evening, and the children were inside with the women, and Hector was in his chair at the far end, and the land stretched out in the long light. "Thomas," Illy said. "Yes. You know I was the one who fell first," Illy said. "And then Caleb, and then you." "I know," Thomas said. "I used to think Papa was right," Illy said. "I mean, I told him he was wrong, but somewhere underneath it I half believed that he might be right, that loving something was a risk you should not take." "And now," Thomas said. Ellie looked at the land and the evening and the lit windows of the house. "Now I think the risk is the whole point," he said. "That if there were no risk it would not be love, it would just be convenience." Thomas nodded slowly. "Mama said the bravest thing was to love completely," he said. "Papa told you that." "Last year," Thomas said. "He has been telling us all things this past year, things she said. Think he has been saving them a long time and now he is ready to give them out." Illy was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "I want to know what she said." Hector, at the far end of the porch, said nothing. He had heard. He always heard everything on this porch, which was his porch and his family, and his 460 acres of everything he had built for a leaner and was still building, in ways he had not anticipated, in every year that followed. He thought about the warning he had given. He thought about the Sunday mornings and the salted oatmeal and the iron fence posts. He thought about Ellie falling first, riding that gray gelding sideways and then vertical and then off, landing in the grass and laughing, and June laughing on the fence rail, and something tilting for the first time, a scale with the first weight on it. He thought about Caleb, the quiet one, being undone by a woman with a ledger and direct eyes who said, "I do both," with the certainty of someone who had never needed permission. He thought about Thomas, the watcher, being finally seen by someone who also watched, who asked about things she wanted to know and heard the answers straight. He thought about a leaner. He thought about what she had said and what he had dismissed, and the 31 years it had taken him to hear it, and how it had not been his sons who had finally taught him. It had been watching them, watching Ellie go first, and Caleb follow and Thomas come last, each of them brave in his own particular way, each of them choosing the risk with their eyes open, each of them proving that the thing he had been trying to protect them from was the very thing that made protection unnecessary. Because you do not need to be protected from loss when you have had the good thing. The having of it, complete and real and lived in every day, is its own answer to the loss. Elinor had known this. She had tried to tell him. He understood it now. He sat in his chair in the autumn evening, and the light went down, and the stars came up. The same stars that had come up over this land every night for 460 acres worth of years, and the windows of the house were lit, and the voices of his sons and their wives and his grandchildren came through. The walls warm and specific, and Hector Calloway, who had driven 3 iron fence posts into the ground and made himself a promise about grief, sat in the late light of his life and let himself feel it all of it, the grief and the joy inseparable and simultaneous, which was, he understood now, the only honest way to feel anything. He had been wrong. He had been wrong for 31 years, and he had almost made his sons wrong too, and he had not. They had been braver than him. They had gone first, one by one, with increasing certainty. Ellie, the laughing one who fell off a horse and found love at the fence rail, Caleb, the steady one who found it in a ledger and a direct gaze, Thomas, the watcher who was finally seen. He was grateful. For the first time in 12 years, sitting in the autumn evening with his family inside, he was simply and completely grateful. The years continued to bring what years bring: good cattle seasons and hard winters and children who grew taller and more themselves with each passing year. William Edward Calloway showed every sign of becoming his father with his mother's precision, a combination that Hector said privately would either run the best ranch in Kansas or the entire state. He had not yet decided which. James George Calloway was his father's son in every way and his grandfather George's in the best ways, loud and warm and entirely without pretension. Henry Calloway, Thomas's boy, learned to read at 3 and by 5 had opinions about everything he read and stated them clearly, which delighted his father and deeply satisfied his mother. Young Illy, Thomas's second, was louder than Henry by a considerable margin and spent his days in motion, which delighted his namesake uncle to no end. Elinor Calloway, Caleb's daughter, named for the grandmother she would never meet, grew into a child with her great-grandmother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes and her mother's absolute precision about everything. And she was, from the earliest age, fierce and kind in equal measure. The first time Hector sat with her on the porch steps and told her about her grandmother Elinor, the girl listened with complete attention and then said, "I want to know everything she said." And Hector told her, because this was someone who deserved to hear it. He told her about the bravery of loving completely. He told her about the laugh like water over smooth river stones. He told her that he had been wrong and her grandmother had been right, and he was telling her so that she would know from the beginning what it had taken him 30 years to learn. "What were you wrong about?" the girl asked. Hector looked at his granddaughter with her grandmother's hair and her father's eyes and said, "I thought that not loving something was a way to protect yourself from losing it." "And is it?" she said. "No," he said. "You lose it anyway. You lose the years of it. That is the only loss that cannot be recovered." The girl considered this with the focused attention of someone taking information she intends to use. "Good," she said. "Then I will love everything properly." "Yes," Hector said. "Do that." She did. They all did. The Calloway Ranch in the years following became the kind of place that draws people in without trying to. The kind of place that has warmth built into its structure the way old houses have it built into their walls, not because anyone installed it deliberately, but because enough living has happened in them to make it permanent. Hector lived to see his granddaughter Elinor Calloway ride her first horse at 5 years old and berate her brothers for doing it wrong at 6. He lived to see Henry Calloway read his first real book and come to the main house specifically to discuss it with his grandfather. And they sat together by the fire, and talked about it the way Thomas and Rebecca talked about books, the way ideas are supposed to be talked about honestly and without hierarchy. He lived to see Ellie's daughter Helen develop her father's laugh and her mother's precision, and become, at 7 years old, the person everyone on the ranch went to when something needed to be thought through clearly. He drove one last fence post in the south pasture in the spring of 1892, and he stood beside it for a long time with his hat in his hands, not for anyone specific. For Alina, for the years he had spent fighting the truth she had given him, for the particular kind of forgiveness that does not require asking, because the person who would grant it already knew and already did, and probably laughed like water over smooth river stones doing it. His sons found him there and stood beside him, all three of them in the spring morning, and nobody said anything because nothing needed to be said. Then Ellie said, "Come inside. June made biscuits." "Clara made the gravy," Thomas said. "Rebecca made the coffee," Caleb added. Hector looked at his three sons, the laughing one who fell first, the steady one who followed, the watching one who came last, and he felt the particular contentment of a man who has been given, late and undeserved and completely real, the answer to the question he has been asking his whole life. He put his hat back on. "Well," he said, "that is a good reason to go inside." They walked back together across the Callaway land, 4 generations of it under their boots, and the spring morning was generous and wide, and the house ahead of them was full of the light and noise of everything they had built, and the cottonwoods along the South Creek were leafing out in that particular pale green that only happens for a few weeks in spring before the summer deepens it, and it was, by any honest measure, exactly enough. It was, by every honest measure, more than enough. The ranch settled into its rhythms with all 6 adults contributing according to their particular strengths, Caleb and Clara managing the accounts and the eastern range, Ellie and June managing the horses and the domestic operation, Thomas and Rebecca managing the records, and the Parker homestead connection that had grown over the years into a small but reliable partnership. Hector managed nothing specific and everything in general, which was the appropriate role for a man of his age and authority, and he did it without interference but with complete availability, which was a different and better thing. The Sunday mornings at the long pine table, which had been extended twice now, to accommodate the full household, were nothing like the Sunday mornings of Hector's warning years. They were loud and full of conversation, and the particular productive chaos of a family that has too many people with opinions, and not enough mourning to get through all of them. The children talked over each other, and the adults talked over the children, and Hector sat at the head of it and ate his biscuits and his eggs and his apple preserves, which June still made every season, and listened to it all with the expression of a man who has arrived, late and grateful, at the exact place he was supposed to be. There were more children in the years that followed. Caleb and Clara had a third, another boy, in 1891. Ellie and June had a third child in 1892, a girl they named Rose, who came into the world exactly on schedule and immediately began developing opinions about things. Thomas and Rebecca had their third in 1893, a girl named Margaret, after nobody in particular, except that they had both always liked the name and felt no obligation to explain themselves. The Callaway Ranch endured through the hard winters of the early 1890, and the cattle market shifts that came with the expansion of the rail lines and the increasing settlement of the Kansas range. And it endured because Caleb managed it with his steady intelligence, and Clara managed its books with her precise accuracy, and Ellie managed its horses with his skill, and June managed its household with her practical warmth, and Thomas managed its documentation and its outside relationships with his careful attention, and Rebecca managed the things that everyone else forgot with her comprehensive memory and her absolute refusal to let important details go unaddressed. And Hector sat at the head of it and watched it, and it was the best thing he had ever built, and he had not built this part of it. His sons had, and the women they had chosen, one by one, against his warning and with his eventual blessing. The laughing one, the steady one, the watching one. The autumn of 1893 on the Callaway Ranch was remarkable in the particular way that things are remarkable when they are also ordinary, when the remarkable has become the texture of daily life, and you only see it clearly by stepping back. Hector stepped back on a Thursday afternoon in October and stood at the edge of the main yard and looked at what he saw. June hanging the washing with Rose on her hip, talking to the baby with the same easy warmth she had brought to the ranch 9 years ago. Clara at the window of the house she and Caleb had built, visible through the glass, bent over her account books with her characteristic total concentration. Rebecca crossing the yard from the south house with Henry and young Ellie behind her, the boys arguing about something with the energetic pointlessness of brothers everywhere. Caleb at the barn with William Edward beside him, showing the boy something about the hinges on the stall door. Ellie on the fence rail watching Thomas work a young horse in the paddock, calling encouragement at exactly the right moments, the way he always did. The children running between everything, connecting it. Hector stood at the edge of it and looked at it for a long time. He thought about Alina. He thought about what she had known and what he had refused to learn. He thought about the warning he had given his sons, repeated like a prayer every Sunday morning for 11 years, and he thought about how they had answered it not with defiance exactly, but with the specific courage of people who have received a false lesson and decided, quietly and without drama, to find the true one. Ellie had fallen first, off a gray horse and into something he could not control and did not regret. Caleb had followed carefully and completely. Thomas had come last, the watcher watched, the observer finally seen. And from those 3 falls had come this: the yard, the houses, the children, the full and complicated and entirely alive life of the Callaway Ranch in the autumn of 1893. He had been wrong. He had been wrong out of love, which is the most forgivable kind of wrong, but wrong nonetheless. He was glad to be wrong. He walked back across the yard and picked up Rose from June's hip, because the baby reached for him with her small certain hands the way babies do when they have decided someone is theirs, and he held her in the October afternoon, and she grabbed his beard and pulled it, which she always did, and which he always pretended to object to, and June laughed the way she always laughed, that easy, generous laugh that had always reminded him, though he had never said so, of water running over smooth river stones. "You are stealing my daughter," Ellie said from the fence rail. "She stole herself," Hector said. "She is a Callaway." "She is," Ellie said, grinning, "takes after the best parts." Hector looked at his middle son, the laughing one who had gone first, who had been brave enough to say, would rather have the grief than the nothing, and had been proven entirely right. He looked at him for a moment with the expression he did not often wear, the open one, and then he said simply, "Yes, she does." He carried the baby inside, and the kitchen was warm, and the supper was going on the stove, and the voices of his family were in every corner of the house, and the Callaway Ranch stood in the October light exactly as it had stood for 20 years, except that it was no longer the place of iron fence posts and Sunday warnings, and a man fighting the only thing that could have made him whole. It was, at last, simply and completely, a home.